If you will, open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 2. If you don't have a Bible and you would like one, we have them back here for you. Paul will get you one. We use the English Standard Version here, so if you want to follow along word for what we're doing, you can use one of those. It's your Bible to keep if you want it. If not, you can open up your phone, do whatever you do. We like that you follow along so you can take notes, so you can kind of learn in a couple of different ways. So, Daniel chapter 2. For those of you that haven't been to New Beginnings Church before, what we do is we use this big fancy word called expository preaching. Now, expository preaching means kind of taking the text and going verse by verse through it and expositing or bringing out the meaning of the text. So this way, you're not taking a subject and cramming the Bible into it. You're taking that subject out of the Bible rather than trying to cram the subject into the Bible. You know, because I don't know if you know this or not, but you can make the Bible say anything you want as long as you take it out of context. So one way that we make sure that we're not taking the Bible out of context is to put it in its big context. So we are in the book of Daniel, and we will be going through the book of Daniel until we are finished. Except for maybe Advent, where we'll stop, maybe. We'll see. We'll talk about that a little while later. So, have you ever been in a situation where you know you need to tell the truth, but you don't really want to? I'll tell you what, it comes around all the time, doesn't it? You know, I work in IT. I'm an IT guy. When something happens in my world, it's usually an extremely costly thing that happens. So it's never fun to tell the person that you need to tell, you know, whether you report to that person or whatever, that it's going to cost lots of money in order to do or fix or change whatever it is that you're doing or fixing or changing. That's not any fun to tell people. But sometimes the truth really hurts, doesn't it? You know you have to do it. You know you have to speak the truth. But it might hurt. Maybe it's going to hurt somebody else. You know, maybe you need to go tell somebody that they're acting like a child, or that maybe you've got to give somebody some bad news. I've had countless conversations with my doctor and my friend about the conversations she's had with other people, where she's had to not give such good news. But the truth has to be spoken. You know, or maybe that truth is going to hurt you, you know? I mean, how many of you have not, or maybe kind of held back on telling the truth if it kind of exposes something that you messed up? Like you go to your boss and, you know, like you need to tell your boss that, you know, oh, by the way, I was the one that made the mistake that's going to cost, you know, $20,000, $30,000, whatever it is, right? You know, like I said, when I make mistakes at work, it costs quite a bit of money. Maybe you need to come clean about something, you know? Or maybe it hurts both people involved, right? Maybe someone you know is claiming to be a Christian, but is not really responding or reacting like one, and you need to hold them accountable. And believe you me, this happens more than you might think here at New Beginnings Church, because this is the kind of church we are. Our goal, our job as elders and teachers of this congregation is to give you what is necessary to be able to be a Christian at work, or in the gym, or at home, or wherever it is, right? We want to equip you to be a Christian. And sometimes that means we have to tell you things you don't want to hear. Like you shouldn't be acting that way. Had that conversation already this week. Actually, a couple of different times. People don't like to hear those kinds of things, you know. But the truth needs to be spoken. A lot of times we avoid telling the truth because it's going to create conflict, right? I avoid conflict like the plague. I don't like conflict. It scares me. It gives me a sick feeling in my stomach. I literally get myself physically ill because I don't like conflict. And you know that I don't like conflict because, it might cause sadness or pain in somebody's life. And, I don't like pain because it hurts me. My wife says that all the time. I love it. It's one of my favorites. Sometimes we're afraid of telling the truth because it might expose a weakness of our own. How many of you have been there? The bottom line is that no matter what the issue is, we are commanded by His holy word to speak truth in all situations. Doesn't matter if it's going to hurt or not. Now we coat that sometimes and try to soften the blow, and that's okay. We should always speak the truth in love rather than smacking somebody upside the head. But we are commanded to speak truthfulness in every situation. In fact, it's one of the top 10, isn't it? Thou shalt not lie. Right? God started off the whole commandment thing, all the things we're ever told to do. One of the very first things He tells us to do is to not lie. That's what we need to do. So let's talk about someone in the Bible who is tasked with telling the truth, a truth that could potentially cost him his life. So, we're in the story of this guy named Nebuchadnezzar. Right? Most people, even people who don't know a lot about the Bible, have heard the name King Nebuchadnezzar. He's an actual king that had a really big impact before Jesus was born. And he was a very important guy in the turning of history into where it started heading now. So Nebuchadnezzar was around for a long time. Even if you're not a Christian, this guy had maybe some kind of impact on your life, or at least you've heard that funky name, right? And he had a dream. He had this dream, a dream that rocked his world. It shook him to his core. And a dream that he couldn't remember. You ever been there? You're in the middle of a dream. You know you need to wake up. You're panicking in this dream. Something is going on in this dream, and you force yourself awake. And it rocked you to your core. It shook you so badly that you couldn't get back to sleep, right? But you couldn't remember what the dream was? You ever been there? Yeah. It happens all the time. It happens all the time. Last week, King Nebuchadnezzar had one of those dreams. So he called together this big collection of people, all these wise men of his kingdom, all the leaders of the wise men of the entire Babylonian Empire, and he tells them, interpret my dreams. And if you learned anything last week, well, I hope you learned a lot last week, as we were talking about earning credibility, right? One of the things was that the Babylonians had this way of cataloging and interpreting dreams. They did this. And we found these in history, and we found these catalogs of these dreams that they had that they would interpret back then. So what they would do is they would take this information, they would take this person's dream, and then they would kind of keep track of what happened in their life, and they would document that. And then they would do that with another dream and another dream and another dream and whatever, and they would take all the common elements of all of that and go, this happened, therefore that dream means this is going to happen in your life, right? It's all hocus pocus. It's all, great movie, by the way. If you're going to watch a Halloween movie, Hocus Pocus, that's a good one to watch. By the way, that's not biblical at all. Just aside, it's one of the better Halloween movies. So the king says, interpret my dream. And these guys say, okay, what's the dream? And Nebuchadnezzar said, I'm not going to tell you my dream. You're going to tell me my dream, And then you're going to tell me what it means. And all the wise men were like, O king, live forever, but you're nuts. You're off your rocker if you think we're going to tell you your dream. Because, well, we can't. So he says, you know what? If you don't tell me your dream, my dream, then I'm going to tear you limb from limb. I'm going to wipe out your houses and your family and all that stuff. I'm going to be really mean to you. So that's what he says. And they're like, oh, this stuff's getting real. So Nebuchadnezzar gives them till morning to interpret the dream. And then he says, kill them all. Kill them all. So we picked up last week with this guy, this guy named Arioch, and he's the captain of the guard. And he's tasked with going out and gathering up all of the wise men and all of the Babylonian Empire, bringing them back to Nebuchadnezzar so that they can be torn limb from limb. Well, this guy named Daniel is part of this. He's sort of a wise man intern, right? So he's not quite a fully ordained wise guy yet, but he's gone through a lot of training, 3 years worth, right? He's learned how to be one of these wise men, but he's not like given full authority. It's kind of like being a pastor in training or whatever, right? So you're not quite there yet. But yet he and his three compadres, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are all grouped into this. And so Arioch shows up at Daniel's doorstep and he says, well, Daniel, the king had this dream. And nobody can interpret it. And now it seems I'm going to have to kill you. Nothing personal. It's all business. So Daniel says, hold the phone. Tell the king that I will tell him what his dream is. And I will tell him what it means. And so Arioch, who liked Daniel, by the way, was like, oh, good. I think we can work with this. So he rushes over and tells the king, hey, I got this guy, Daniel, and he can tell you what your dream was and what it meant. So Daniel and his three buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you're going to learn these names, okay? They assumed the battle position. What's the battle position in spiritual warfare? On your knees. On your knees. You fight a spiritual battle on your knees in prayer. So they went to prayer. And during the night, at some point in time, Daniel is given through God this vision of what the dream was and what it meant. So then he goes to the king. Last week we left off with Daniel giving an introduction to the king. So let's pick up in verse 31. Okay, everybody caught up so far? This is what's happening now in the book of Daniel. So verse 31. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. So this image is really kind of a big statue, really big statue. I mean, like Statue of Liberty big, right? It's really, really a big statue-looking thing, and it's intimidating, to say the least. I mean, intimidating enough to have scared Nebuchadnezzar. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. I want you to notice a few things here. First, starting from the top down. Okay, this is important. It will come up again in a couple of verses. Starting from the top down, these metals that this is made out of become less precious. Right? Starts out with gold, then it goes silver, then it goes bronze, and then it ends down here with iron. Okay? So it gets less precious as it goes along. less valuable, if you will. Second, they also become stronger. Right? Has anybody ever messed with actual gold? I mean, not the stuff that they put in rings because they have to mix it with something in order to make it solid. And gold is actually soft and kind of pliable, right? And this is actually solid gold. So it's soft and it's pliable, it's malleable, it's moldable. And then silver's next, which is less pliable, less moldable. And then bronze, which is even a little bit harder material and still a little less pliable and moldable. And then it's iron. And if you've ever done any kind of iron work, when I was in Cub Scouts like a zillion years ago, we did some iron work with, I made a boot horn. Those of you that don't know what that is, just ask somebody wearing boots. Okay? Or a boot jack, not a boot horn. Boot jack. So, and it was made out of these little iron rods, right? And we had to really do a lot of work to get them bent into the right shape in order for us to do it. And then that's why a lot of weaponry was made out of iron, because you had to take a super, super hard stone in order to like sharpen the edges and things like that. And it kept its sharpness for a long time. Very hard, tough, dense metal. Okay? Everything was stronger right up until you got to the feet. Because the feet were iron mixed with clay. Okay, now there's no reason you would do this. There is a reason that you would put filler into metals, but there's no reason that you would put clay into metal. This is pure imagery, right? So this iron is mixed with clay, and this weakens the iron significantly. Okay, everybody with me so far? All of this is going to come back. Verse 34. As you looked, now remember, this is Daniel speaking to Nebuchadnezzar. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand. So some kind of stone was carved out, but not by any human. And it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them into pieces. Interesting that whomever it was that threw this big rock knew where to throw it. Because if you throw this big rock at the solid iron, what's it going to do? Doink. It's going to bounce off. But if you hit it where it's weak, what's going to happen? It's going to crumble, right? Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like chaff on the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. As if it never existed. As if it never existed. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This stone, once it did the job of killing off this statue, became a mountain. A mountain so big that it engulfed the entire earth. Okay? This is the dream. Now, let's learn its interpretation. Verse 37. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom of power, the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he was given wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all, you are the head of gold. So Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. Daniel is saying, you are the one that is starting everything from which I am about to speak. It starts with you. You're the beginning. But remember that it was God who has given you this realm and the authority to rule over it. He doesn't skip that piece. He tells Nebuchadnezzar where his power came from. Okay? Verse 39. Another kingdom inferior to you shall rise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth, and there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all of these. So, remember I said this stuff would come back? Here it is. Now, I mentioned last week that God gave Nebuchadnezzar one of the single most important visions ever in all of history. This is it. This is it. Pay attention to what this means. The imagery of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, that this dream that he had, was all about what was to come. What was to come. What is that called?
Prophecy.
Prophecy. Prophecy. His kingdom, the kingdom of what? Babylon. The kingdom of Babylon, it will be replaced. It will not last forever. There will be another kingdom that follows after it, and then a third, and then a fourth. So for all you history buffs, I know there's a few of you out here that like to delve into these kinds of things, and this was really interesting. There's so much information out there about these empires that we're about to speak about. That head of gold, that was the Babylonian Empire. Okay? The Babylonian Empire was predicted years and years and years prior to that as the one coming from the north that was going to wipe out Jerusalem. Okay? So this was prophesied many years prior. Many years prior. Nebuchadnezzar, he was the king of that empire. So that empire actually lasted roughly 90-ish years, like 87, 88 years, right? So in the big scheme of things, not very long, right? So we're thinking, this is 2,500 years ago. This empire, the Babylonian Empire, lasted like 90 years out of this 2,500 years since then. But we still talk about it. We still know it. We still study it. And King Nebuchadnezzar, he was the king of this for roughly 43 years. So roughly half of that time, King Nebuchadnezzar was the king over Babylon. Okay? He besieged Judea and plundered Jerusalem. He destroyed their temple. Then the silver chest and the arms, now we're moving down that body, right? So the silver chest and arms, roughly in here, and the arms, they were made out of silver. This represents the Medo-Persian Empire. This one lasted about 200 years. Now, aside from you really intense history buffs, we don't ever study the Medo-Persian Empire very much, do we? But it's there. If you study some ancient history, it is there. It is intense. There was a lot of good stuff. This kingdom, or this empire, was made known by this guy named Cyrus the Great. He was not the first king of the Medo-Persian Empire, but he was the one who made it well known, because he was the one that was able to take over Babylon. Okay? And extremely important here, he was the one that allowed the 70 years to come to an end. Now remember that the Jews were in exile for 70 years. He was the one that allowed that to come to an end. And it was prophesied that this guy named Cyrus would be so great that he would allow the Jews to go back and rebuild their city and rebuild their temple. That's Isaiah chapter 44 and 45. Amazing. Amazing. Then we move down the body a little bit more. The bronze, the midsection, and the thighs. This was the Greek Empire, also known as the Macedonian Empire. This one also lasted somewhere around 200 years. And, there's not a lot of intense things that happened during that time. Right? Now, what language did most people speak when Jesus was around? Greek, right? So it had an influence. It had an influence. But it existed pretty much peacefully alongside the nations around it. But eventually, Rome entered the picture. And Rome wanted more. Rome wanted more. So they conquered the Macedonian Empire through 4 wars. And they were the legs of iron. They were the legs of iron. This Roman Empire, they fully conquered the Macedonian Empire in 186 BC. So roughly 180 years-ish before Jesus was even on the picture. Okay? So we have the Roman Empire now in place, in control, as Jesus enters the picture. Okay? Now, the Roman Empire, the interesting thing about this was that it lasted in various forms really until the Byzantine Empire collapsed when Constantinople fell in 1453. So this hung on for roughly 1,600 years. And they said Rome doesn't fall in a day, right? No, it took like 1,600 years, right? Let's carry on, and we're going to talk a little bit more and go a little deeper. Everybody with me so far? Yep. All right. There's going to be a test afterward. Okay? I'm ready. Especially for Joe, because now he's like, superhero. Right? All right. Verse 41. And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. Now we're back to the feet, right? It shall be a divided kingdom. What's it? The Roman Empire shall be a divided kingdom, but some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with the soft clay, firm but brittle. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage of the kingdoms. Right, they did intermarry, right, but this isn't what we're talking about. We're talking about marrying the kingdoms together, right, okay? But they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. One of the reasons that the Roman Empire was so successful was when they conquered an enemy, a nation, a people. They sort of allowed them to exist autonomously. In other words, they let them continue kind of in the way they did things. Right? And so every once in a while, they had to break out that rod of iron and give them the smackdown. Anybody remember the story of Jesus or Paul, right? What was going on at that point in time? The Roman Empire, there were these uprisings in Jerusalem and Judea, and so the Roman Empire had to come in and give them the smackdown, right? They had to use those rods of iron occasionally, and Rome was hated by the people that conquered them, even though they kind of allowed them to exist sort of on their own. They were hated by the people that conquered them. So, when these uprisings happened, the Roman Empire, the Roman army would come in and they would squash those uprisings. And in the case of 70 AD, we talked about this a lot when we were studying Acts, right? What happened in 70 AD? The Roman Empire came in and took out Jerusalem and took out the temple, obliterated it, right? Obliterated it. So they had to use that rod of iron. It was this semi-peaceful coexistence that made the Roman Empire so successful. But it was also this semi-peaceful coexistence that made them more brittle and weak. All of this intermarrying of kingdoms ultimately led to their destruction. So the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw was a great big statue made of 4 different metals, each with their own properties and each representing their own corresponding kingdoms. And here's where it gets interesting. Let's talk about that stone. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. In the end, the kingdom established by God will be for him and him alone. It will not be a kingdom of and for another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from the mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. So while all of this is going on, all of these kingdoms are working through their lifespans and their existence and all of this stuff, the God of heaven, the one true God, our triune God, will set up a kingdom of his own. A kingdom so strong that it will never be divided or destroyed. So great that it will break apart every single other earthly kingdom. And it will blow them away like chaff in the wind. Now this kingdom, capital K, not a little k, not a lowercase k, because this is God's kingdom and it will stand forever. And that stone that was launched into the statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream was none other than the one that broke apart the statue, the one that took the place of all the earthly kings. That was none other than Jesus Christ himself. The mighty stone on which the builders build, the capstone, the cornerstone, the anchor of the everlasting kingdom of heaven is Jesus Christ, the founder of our church. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain and its interpretation sure. Daniel is saying, O king, last forever, live forever, like it or not, this is what's going to happen. Of this you can be sure, because our God does not lie. So this is it. Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar the dream and what it meant. He didn't hold back, even though this was bad news. Why was this bad news? Because every king throughout history thought that his kingdom was the be-all and end-all. Every king throughout history thought that his kingdom would last forever. And his legacy would reign supreme for all time. And it was Daniel's responsibility to tell him that it was not going to last forever. In fact, we know now that it only lasted maybe another 80 years if he was lucky. Daniel came to the king, one who could do so much more than terminate his job, one who could terminate his existence. And he came to that king and he faced the music and he told the truth. No matter what the consequences could be, he told the truth. And we're worried about telling the truth because it might hurt our feelings or somebody else's. He put his life on the line to tell the truth. And how did the king react to all of this? This overwhelmingly bad news for his kingdom? Well, he fell on his face and he paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery to me." The king acknowledged Daniel's God as being the one true God. Above all the gods in his belief system, above even himself. But this newfound faith doesn't last all that long, as we will find in the next weeks to come. Daniel's going to have to tell the truth several times. Several times. Verse 48. Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. So he went from wise man intern to prime minister over all of Babylon, simply for telling the truth. Even a truth that wasn't a good one to be told. Not to Nebuchadnezzar anyway. And he was put in charge of all the other wise men. Remember that, because that comes back to bite him. This is important a little bit later on in the book of Daniel. The other wise men didn't like the fact that this guy was over him. So what did Daniel do first with this new wealth, power? He took his friends. He appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel himself remained in the king's court. He made his 3 compadres his 3 right-hand men, which would also prove to be a problem a little bit later on in the book as well. You see, it seems that people who grew up in Babylon, who rose to and worked their way up to this power, they didn't like being ruled over by somebody who was supposed to have been their slave. They kind of resented that. Remember, Joseph? Right? How many times throughout history, biblical history, did something like this happen where the person who was obeying God rose to a position of power and it didn't sit well with the people he went over? But Daniel, he hung out with the king because his time would come again. Believe me. Daniel was there for 70 years and he made a massive impact. Not only in the life of Nebuchadnezzar, but the rest of the kings that were there too. Loved ones, Daniel was faced with an extremely volatile situation. One in which his life was literally on the line. And he trusts that God will take care of him. Even though that might mean that he gets put to death. And he tells Nebuchadnezzar the truth. A truth that he didn't want to tell. As a matter of fact, when he retells this same truth again in a few chapters, he says, I don't want to tell you this. Nebuchadnezzar didn't want to hear it. The truth that is one of the single most important and explicit pieces of prophecy in all of history. One that foretells the destruction of his very own kingdom and of the coming of the Messiah. And instead of being put to death, Daniel is put in a place where God would use him to usher in his own kingdom. Would use him to usher in his story, his history. You know, you may not know what's on the other side of telling the truth. It may be a promotion, or it may be losing your job. It may be a raise, or it might be a dock in your pay. It may be good, or it may be bad. But always, always, always tell the truth. You know, that starts with telling the truth to yourself. You are the hardest person to tell the truth to. Start with yourself. Come clean with God. In this time where we celebrate Holy Communion together, be honest with yourself. Tell the truth to yourself. And tell God. Confess. Repent.